Right. Let's begin. It's 10:02 right now. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Forest Wood Products Australia Economics Program webinar series in 2024. A bit of background. Forest and Wood Products Australia, or FWPA, is an industry-owned not-for-profit organization. We are one of the 15 Rural Research and Development Corporation. We partner with the Australian government and industry stakeholders and invest in research and development marketing. It's to improve profitability in the industry, productivity, competitiveness, and sustainability in our industry. Before starting, in the spirit of reconciliation, Forest and Wood Product Australia acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia, and we acknowledge their connections to the land and their custodianship of country and forests. We pay our respect to elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. The economics program within FWPA provides regular updates in the industry with data, information, analysis, and market research. The webinar series here is part of the economics research program that provide information and findings on key issues. The first webinar in 2024, this webinar series, we like to highlight the ongoing housing crisis. It's a very popular one right now, and how the supply side and the government address the issue. For the first webinar, I think that there's a key points you'd like to discuss. First is the housing crisis as a result of, well, we can say this long-term poor planning. The supply of the new homes, some people say that will be the lowest in the next 2 years. In addition to this, I think I read in the Australian Financial Review yesterday, ongoing with the housing issue, the property editor Nick Lenahan sending me that the soaring costs make the building new homes uneconomical. And that will restrict home completion below demand until the end of the decade. So that's only with the next 2 years, but it will be an ongoing issue in the next decade. So we'll see. That's from the survey of 12 property analysts and economists. Then we also have the trend of dwelling supply. It's not aligned with the migration intake and population trend. There's a constraint to building more homes, include the industry capacity, including our industry, timber industry, and the urban planning reform. Challenges from the industry as well, and this include the financial risk, access to capital, and also the supply chain disruption. In this webinar, we already have 3 speakers. Thank you for our, I can say this is the expert panel. First, we have Nerida Conisbee. This is the Chief Economist, Ray White. We have also Dr. Liz Allen. Liz is a demographer and senior lecturer at the Center for Social Policy Research at the Australian National University. And we also have Dr. Tom Alves. Tom is a head development in the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute or Harvard. Without further ado, I think that's 10:05. I'd like to introduce the first speaker, Nerida Conisbee. Nerida is one of the Australia's leading property expert. You can say that. You know that she regularly provides market commentary to a wide range of Australian media outlets. Very common. We see her in the ABC and also in radio podcast. She also contributes to a web of publication. If you check the Ray White website, it's very regular. We have the updates. Nerida also the Construction Forecasting Council Chair and a member of the Australian Taxation Office Foreign Investment Stakeholder Group. Is that right? I'm saying that, Nerida? Because I checked that data. She also provides updates on the property market condition to the major government bodies. She has more than 20 years property research experience throughout the Asia Pacific, and currently held senior position within commercial agencies and major consulting firm. Our experience cover residential, commercial property from both an investor and occupier's perspective. And Nerda, I think that's
that
Sydney.
sums it up.
Thanks. I think that's a sum of
a
everything.
lovely intro. Thank you, Eric. Okay, I'll share my screen and get straight into it. Okay, so I do have a presentation here. So can everyone see that okay? Excellent. All right, so today I'm going to run you through what we're seeing in the property market at the moment. As Eric said, it has been a very, very strong market in 2023, and it continues to be strong in 24. And a lot of it has to do with housing supply. It is cheaper to buy than build in many places. So that has been a key factor. And also added to that we did see record levels of migration last year. So that pressure on housing supply was quite extreme. So we really didn't build enough homes. So there was a lot of challenges in the market, which led to the market moving in exactly the opposite direction that many people predicted at the end of 2022. So at the end of 2022, we did see this incredible increase in inflation. So you can see there what happened to quarterly CPI. It was the highest level in about 50 years. We hadn't seen inflation moving that quickly for a very long time. It did lead to a lot of conversations around a house price crash. So even a very respected magazine, which I really respect, The Economist, came out with a front cover talking about a house price horror show, and they targeted specifically Australia as being the worst impacted by very high inflation and the very high interest rates that were coming through. So that didn't happen, obviously. So today what I will talk about is why it didn't happen, but also more specifically why we do expect to see prices to continue to rise for at least the next 12 months and probably longer, given how long it takes to increase housing supply. So in terms of interest rates, of course, have risen very, very rapidly. I'm sure a lot of you have mortgages. I've got a Sydney-sized mortgage, so this is very, very annoying for me. But what it has been doing is, or what the Reserve Bank have been doing is trying to get this inflation rate down, and it has been successful. You can see there that inflation is coming down, but it's not decreasing quite as rapidly as the Reserve Bank hoped. So you would have seen that data coming out, the inflation data coming out on Wednesday. That inflation number dramatically changed the outlook for interest rates. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes as to how dramatically it did change that outlook. But for now, it does look like the cash rate has peaked. There are some commentators that are expecting another increase. Personally, I think it's unlikely. But what does seem likely is that it will remain elevated for longer than we hoped, and that's really challenging at the moment in a market where we do have too few homes and where high interest rates is one of the factors that does prevent homes being developed. When we look around Australia, just moving straight on to house price growth, you can see here how extreme it has been over the previous year. So this takes us to the end of March. We're getting end of April data today. But all around Australia, we have seen this very, very strong growth in house prices. Really leading the way is Perth. Perth prices are up over 20%. But also other places such as Adelaide and Brisbane are up around 12%. Sydney, even though it is an incredibly expensive city now with a median well over 1.5 million, sitting at 9%. And then we've got Melbourne, which has remained far more affordable and hasn't seen quite the rate of growth as we've seen elsewhere at 5.7%. So everywhere is seeing price growth. I think probably one of the most interesting things, though, that's happened through COVID is this reordering of markets. We now have places like the Gold Coast and Sunshine Coast that are more expensive than Melbourne. Canberra, never expected it to hit $1 million for a long time. Now it's sitting at 1.2. And Adelaide has finally overtaken Hobart. So Hobart was always the most affordable city in Australia, but it really took off the last decade. Prices rose very rapidly. Adelaide sort of stuck behind, but Adelaide now is starting to see some decent price growth. So everywhere's seeing price growth, but there is quite a significant reordering, and a lot to do with population growth. And Liz will talk about that in more detail, but also to do with wealth creation, particularly in WA and also South Australia. There has been significant wealth creation in both those places as well, which has been a major contributor to what we've seen in terms of pricing. Prices are well and truly above their peaks. So again, you can see here what's happened over time. We had that really strong surge in house prices during the pandemic, where the median moved very, very quickly, particularly for houses, but also for apartments. We did have that brief downturn in 2022. So prices did fall back as interest rates started to rise. But then they took off again at the end of 22. So you can see that they are steadily increasing up again, even though interest rates are remaining very, very high at the moment, and also not looking like they're going to come down particularly quickly. So despite all these interest rate challenges, despite the cost of finance being incredibly expensive, it hasn't been able to stop this steady increase in house prices. And it does look like it will continue. Again, I won't go into too much detail here, but this chart does show house prices around Australia. So I've already gone through capital cities, with Perth seeing the strongest growth. But also what's interesting is regional areas. So regional WA being the strongest performer, really driven by mining, also by agriculture. There's been some really strong conditions, particularly in the wheat belt region, which has contributed to growth, but also South Australia. So South Australia has been one of the strongest economic performers over the past 3 years or so, partly because the Premier has been doing a pretty good job in terms of attracting investment, attracting tourism dollars. There's been a little bit of population growth, but also some wealth creation, primarily driven by an increase in copper mining. So these green energy minerals are starting to have a real impact on regional areas in WA and South Australia, and is contributing to wealth and contributing to population growth, and also to what we're seeing in terms of house price increases. Regional Victoria, again, the slowest market at the moment, does seem to be driven a lot by what happened through COVID. The economy does seem to be struggling a little bit. I don't expect that to continue. I think one of the things that we will see, or one of the things we are seeing already in Melbourne and also regional Victoria, is population growth starting up again. So that will create pressure on housing demand. Also, Victoria and Melbourne, we are seeing too few homes being built. So a combination of those factors is likely to lead to pricing being far stronger this year. And we have already seen that in the first quarter of this year. So house prices have increased very quickly, but also unit prices are increasing quite rapidly. And I think probably the main city to point out here is Brisbane. Brisbane apartments, I don't think they're increasing. Yeah, but we're actually seeing Brisbane apartments seeing stronger price growth than we are seeing house prices, which is quite unusual. Typically, unit prices do increase a little bit more slowly. But at the moment, we do have quite, sorry, we have quite a severe shortage of apartments in Brisbane at the moment. So it is leading to this elevated pricing compared to what we're seeing in houses. So quite unusual, but definitely worth pointing out. And then when we look at regional areas, obviously regional South Australia is probably more townhouses rather than apartments, but showing the strength of housing demand. Also in regional South Australia, I did mention mining, but also agriculture does seem to be quite a significant contributor. And when we have a look at the places that are seeing the most price growth in that part of Australia, it does seem to be that southeastern area that's seeing the strongest growth at this point. So house prices have risen rapidly, rents have as well. So you can see here that both houses and units have seen very, very strong growth in rents. Again, you know, when we're looking at what's driving this, it is fundamentally supply and demand. We just don't have enough rental properties. We don't, and we've also had population growth. So when we have a look at the strength of market and the strength of housing demand, this is often a better indicator because it's not so influenced by access to finance in the same way house prices are. But definitely shows why we saw that strong growth in pricing, even though interest rates had increased very rapidly because of the tenant side being so strong. This has sparked a lot of alarms about affordability, and obviously you can see here why, because of how sharply rents have risen over that pandemic period. But also it shows how affordable rents were prior to the pandemic, and so much so that when we look at OECD data on rental affordability, in 2020, Australia had some of the best rental affordability in the world. Only France and Germany had better rental affordability than us. But then it has changed quite significant. And again, this is something that's been happening globally. We are seeing challenges for renters in places like the UK. New Zealand is probably actually the worst in the world in terms of rental affordability. Even places which have been historically great places for renters, such as Germany and France, are also seeing problems. So these challenges we have around housing are not just limited to Australia. It is a global phenomenon. And one of the things, though, that we are able to solve in terms of this is density. And that's really where we are going to have to become a little bit more accepting of, or we're going to have to become a lot more accepting of it, because that really is the key to ensuring that we do have greater levels of affordability. So in terms of whether growth will continue, it will. You know, at this point, there's nothing to suggest that we won't see a continuation of this strong house price growth. In terms of interest rates, though, it is likely that the timing will be pushed out, and I'm constantly updating this table, this slide, and I didn't update the heading, but I did update the text. But right now, it is likely that interest rates won't be cut over the next 12 months. It's likely to be over the next 18 months. And the reason for that was that elevated inflation data that we saw come out last week. So you can see there my comment at the bottom, 24th of April, so last Wednesday morning, the market was predicting an interest rate cut in October this year. So it was looking quite soon in terms of when it was going to happen. That inflation data came out, and the timing is now being pushed out to late 2025. So this can change very, very quickly. It's very hard to predict interest rates at the moment because of really it's so dependent on that inflation data that's coming through. Some quarters it's looking great, next quarter it's not looking so great. But globally, what we are seeing is that rates do seem to have peaked, and depending where you are, it is looking like cuts are imminent, at least in the next 12 months, maybe the next 18 months. The next country or the next region to move on interest rates is likely to be the European Union. They're predicting around a June cut. UK is probably next. The UK is now in recession. They're probably going to go in about September. And then the US will probably go around a similar time. So it is highly uncertain when we will see rate cuts, but it will happen. And personally, I think it will be within at least the next 12 months. But right now, the market is predicting a little bit of a longer lag in terms of when it's going to happen. So another big driver of price growth will be what's been happening with construction costs. You can see there that big surge we saw in 2022, and that started off as being challenges around supply of materials. So obviously timber was a big one. We didn't have enough timber to build all the homes that were required to be built. But also supply chain blockages were also a problem. That then led to some challenges with productivity. Obviously, it's very difficult to finish a home when the bath doesn't arrive. So we did see this delay in housing construction. And then we also had a lot of labour problems. So during the pandemic, we didn't have enough labour, and then that labour has started to come back, but there was a lag, and then we flowed through. We started to see a lot of builders and a lot of contractors head into receivership. So it has been a very, very tough situation for the construction industry. You can see there that the rate of increase has slowed, but we haven't seen a drop in construction costs. So they are far elevated compared to where they were prior to the pandemic. So this is a challenge. It's a challenge for housing supply. It's also a challenge because it is so expensive now to build a new home, and more expensive. It is in many places now far cheaper to buy an existing property than it is to build a new one. So until we see a match between those two costs, it is unlikely we will see a high level of development taking place. So I think negatively, probably the most negative thing to come out of that is that prices have to increase to get more homes built, because it's highly unlikely we will see a big drop in construction costs. Another driver of what's been happening in terms of house prices is a decline in average household size. So more people living alone. I won't talk too much on this because I'm sure Liz will cover it, but this is a big challenge for housing supply because we don't have many small homes. Australia is dominated by big family homes. We're very low density. We've got the lowest densities in the world, but the future is smaller households. It is more single person households, and that's a real challenge for housing supply, making sure that we build enough homes for people, and also getting people out of very big homes and into smaller homes is a big challenge as well, because older people like being in their family homes. There's tax benefits to doing so, and also it's obviously personally very difficult for people to move out. So there are some challenges there as well. Cheaper to buy than build. So I spoke about this a little bit before, but you can see here what's happened with construction CPI compared to house prices. It is very, very expensive to build at the moment. And one of the things we have found is that on the urban fringe of many places around Australia, homes that were built, say, 2 years ago are far cheaper than brand new homes. So when we have a look at house price growth at a suburb level, we're seeing places such as Armidale in WA. So Armidale right on the urban fringe, seeing very, very strong price growth. Similarly in Sydney, if you have a look at places that are on the urban fringe close to new development areas, they're also seeing very strong price growth. So until we start to see that level of pricing match the cost of building a new home, it will limit the level of supply that takes place. Migration, I won't speak too much on this, but obviously it has been very high. And then when we look at the number of homes that we do require, last year we needed around 250,000 new homes. We built around 175,000. So we do have a significant shortfall in the number of homes being built. Longer term, the housing accord has been set out where the federal government does aim to build 1.2 million homes. We are off to a bad start. We're nowhere near reaching that level at this point. But historically, we're also off to, we don't really have a precedent of when we did build that many homes. We've never built that many homes. The closest we got was the end of last decade. So the 5 years leading up to 2019. But that was a time when we had the highest level of inflow of Chinese money into Australian property. So there was a lot of money being funneled into building new homes. We also had very, very high levels of we had a lot of high density development taking place as well, particularly in inner suburbs of Melbourne. Melbourne City, for example, saw record levels of development taking place. It was very high density and it was very well funded. So this is a challenge at the moment that we have, that we don't have that money coming in. So there's really not the funding to be able to build that many homes. So the budget will be interesting, see how they propose to fund it. It's likely to be build to rent, but that won't be enough. So it is going to be the big challenge, I guess, over the next 5 years to get enough homes built. So I will finish up there and pass it back to Erick.
Thanks, Nerida. It's very insightful, and I think that's economists right now is a bit nervous about the latest inflation figure, and that's the thing we keep like changing whether that the Reserve Bank will cut the interest rate this year or later this year. I think that's also become the current debate, and as you said, in terms of the building. Buy it's cheaper than the build. That's one that it's current, because if we talk about the market value and the asset value ratio, that's a bit quite a challenging out there, right? For the next speaker, I think that we have Dr. Liz Allen. A bit of introduction. Liz has experience working in public and academic sectors. I think some of short bio here. In 2018, she was named among the national top 5 academics in the humanities and social sciences by the ABC. I read Liz's first books, The Future of Us. That's very interesting. The book was published in 2020. Very recommended. That tracks Australia's demographic journey through times and opportunities for a fairer and more equal nation. And latest in 2023, Liz was named a woman to watch by the AFR. I think that's the rest of this. Liz's doctoral research, I think I mentioned this, explore the individual, family, and neighborhood contribution to child access rate and screen time among the Australian cohort. See that the dissertation at the NU. And formerly, Liz also a representative for the network of early career teachers, academic and researchers at the ANU. Now she served on the ANU Council as the elective staff for 2022 and 2024. Previously, she's the Vice President of the Australian Population Association. Give to you, Liz, please.
Thank you for that. I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Please bear with me as I do this. I'm hoping you all can see that. Excellent, excellent. Okay, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I come to you from lands that have never been ceded, those of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people in Canberra. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and particularly to those in the audience who are First Nations peoples. I'm going to talk to you about the demographic considerations amongst this conversation today. And it's very important that after we talk about the housing context, that we then consider the population side of things and the like. So I want to start by saying some things, some truths that may feel somewhat uncomfortable. Yes, Australians are living longer and we're having fewer children. And as you see with this population pyramid that looks a little bit like a fan as it goes out over time, this is the historical population, the current population, and the projected population. What I want to draw your attention to here is the beehive shape of this pyramid, whereby we're seeing that fan out of the population of the older ages as we get into the projection side out to 2071. And I want to say, as you're mulling this chart, that what we think we know about the housing system in Australia is wrong. Now, that's a pretty bit of a, mic drop to state. And I further want to say that population, which is often shorthand for immigration, is a scapegoat for Australia's housing system that is broken. So Australia's broken housing system is being blamed on an easy scapegoat. That is, people that cannot vote, people that are not citizens and cannot vote for commentary and so on that is more pleasing, and vice versa. So I want to kind of have that backdrop to this conversation, this part of the seminar today. I further want to add that we proved during the period of COVID, when we had a natural experiment, a population experiment, by way of closed borders, that saw that migrants don't contribute to housing distress, migrants don't steal local jobs, and migrants don't contribute to inflation. So we have this kind of weird situation where what we thought we knew is perhaps not holding true. And we need to keep thinking about this, because to this date, I've not seen any data or any analysis that has really considered the relationship between population growth, read immigration, and population and housing prices rather. Further, if we drill down into what is causing or what is the largest share of population growth, it is immigration. But if we look at immigration, it's students that is contributing to the population growth quite earnestly. And we know that students live around academic institutions. A lot of them live on campus, in fact, and many live in shared housing and so on. So we've really got to be careful here with the kind of relationships that we established between data points that haven't really been scientifically tested. So as I said, we're living into our 80s. We are now at the point where we have below replacement fertility, and that's been the case since the 1970s. That in its own right is not a problem. It means that women in particular are taking greater control of their reproductive health and so on. What is a problem, however, is that young people are citing the inability to have children because of insurmountable barriers such as housing affordability, job insecurity, gender inequality, and climate change. These barriers are preventing people from achieving their desired family size, a child, or subsequent children. We also know that we have a shrinking workforce, and that's something that I'll talk about in more detail in a moment. We have seen in the last little period of time, particularly post-COVID, borders reopening and so on, that we have seen a high short-term growth, quite high, in fact. But let me tell you something of what we're seeing in the moment. We saw during COVID, and you can see this big dip of the components of natural increase and net migration change during the COVID period. What happened when the way that we measure net overseas migration, we factor in the incoming versus the outgoings, and it's a net calculation. We saw during COVID people told to go home. So students went home. Many people who were establishing their lives and called Australia home went back to their country of origin. We also saw students not arriving onshore. Then, as COVID borders reopened, we then saw one side of the net equation change while the other one didn't. We didn't have the outgoing numbers because they had already left in significant numbers to the point where we had negative net overseas migration. So what we're seeing now is an artificial blip owing to really this kind of the closed border situation. So something to be mindful of. We are expected to see population, particularly immigration, return to more stable rates of growth. But in the long term, there is potential for population decline. And I'll get to more of that in a moment. And that's because yes, migration is the biggest growth factor. It's keeping this country economically afloat, to be honest. We are likely to see, it's projected, that more deaths than births will occur around 2054. That means that we will have a natural decline in our population. That is, the local population of births and deaths will see one side of the population balancing equation decline. That means that without immigration, our population will decline as it's expected at the moment. Further, the proportion of our household type that is one person, so people living alone, is increasing. The type of family composition and the composition of households, those people living in households, is changing. We're seeing different ways of living, different ways of families being created and people forming families and so on. But this one-person household shift over time, as Nerida said, is something that we're not really prepared for. And quite frankly, there are environmental considerations among this. What this shows, though, in the broader sociological consideration, is that the status quo of Australian housing no longer fits. We're still operating in a 1950s notion of housing, the white picket fence on a particular acreage with X number of children and parents. That's not the case anymore. And we need to reconsider and go back to the drawing board and reimagine what housing is in this country. And it was fitting that Nerida said that she is a homeowner or on the way to owning a home in Sydney. I'm a lifelong renter and I'll likely never own a property because I've come in a generation where I'm not able to buy into the housing market, and I had children before I owned a home. So this kind of thing is going to begin to get bigger because we know that the rates of home ownership had declined generation on generation since the 1950s. So some further considerations to think about. Our housing, we kind of can thinking that it's, well, same, but it's not same. It is different. Where and how we live is changing. We thought that regionalisation was going to be a big thing during COVID. Not this demographer. It was very short-lived. Yes, people moved to the regions, but again, that was more of a quirk of how net figures are calculated. We are not going to see population decentralised. We are going to have to confront the reality that we need to move up rather than out in our cities. And so the YIMBY movement, the Yes in My Backyard movement is going to really, I guess, take hold and really rise to the fore in the coming years. People are not just living alone, they are aged and living alone. And that's something that we need to consider from an aging side, but also a welfare and care side. Density, it's going to increase. Multi-families will live and reside together in households. That is, unrelated families will start seeing the benefits because they are smaller in size by way of fewer children, perhaps not even with children, that living in family-sized households from the 1970s that have been built since and standing since then cater for and will enable households where unrelated multiple families will reside together to counter the affordability issue. Yes, people are working more from home. It is a reality now, and that will have to factor into the way that we do housing. We're also seeing multi-generational living. That is, we're seeing grandparents reside with their children and their grandchildren. multi-gen and multi-family households are something that we really haven't understood by way of data, and it's something that we know on the ground is happening. So housing will likely need to accommodate to reduce conflict where these types of households are present. So that is multiple kitchens, multiple dining areas, multiple living areas, so that this independence among these groups can be maintained. All while we talk about this, we often forget about the missing middle. Poverty and the cost of living has gone mainstream in Australia in the last 5 years. We now are talking about what used to be a fringe or marginalised issue by way of not being able to afford rent, not being able to afford the mortgage, not being able to afford groceries. This is something that governments need to address. They cannot scapegoat population and immigration for their policy failures. This policy failure in terms of housing is decades, generations since post-World War II in the making. In sum, Australia's housing system is broken. And it is among the top reasons for young people not having wanted children. From a demographic and a sociological perspective, this concerns me. Young people are not getting the go. They are not having the living standards of generations prior. Our generational bargain is broken. So the living standards of young people are likely to be less than their parents and their grandparents. And that sends all sorts of concerning messages to young people. With that comes uncertainty. With an uncertain notion of the future comes fraying social cohesion. And we see all sorts of bad things happen. Meanwhile, we don't have the labourers that we require to build homes. It will take time to train locals, so we require migration, skilled migration, where builders come to Australia to help us build roads, services, work in our schools, work in our hospitals, and so on, to help maintain our living standards. There's a saying by the great Kevin Costner from the movie Field of Dreams: if you build it, they will come. This idea that decentralised population and so on will come to the regions if you build the infrastructure. Trouble is, we've not got infrastructure in the cities, right? So we need the roads and transportation. We need housing to be near job opportunities. We need services to be located next to homes and housing developments. We need hospitals, healthcare, and so on accessible. Education opportunities as well, because we know that people move to places where their education and their employment opportunities are maximised. That's a good thing, right? We want people to have successful lives, but we're not seeing housing sit alongside industry and so on. And that has an impact on people, well-being, but also population and young people's certainty of the future. We're also in the context of the world where climate boiling is an issue. Demography, we are competing with the likes of the UK, Canada, Germany, the US. These places are more enticing to skilled migrants than a country at the bottom of the world. So we are going to need to look to the region more earnestly than something afar. Our immigration is going to be important, and we will see immigration used as a political football, as we have done in time past. And it will be filled with misinformation and disinformation, as we've seen on social media in the last week or so. Geopolitics plays a part here. And it's interesting that Australia is looking, Ed Husick, the Minister, is looking at ways that we can rebuild brand Australia in terms of innovation and science and technology and so on. It'll be interesting to see whether that actually works, to be honest. And we also have resource challenges, money, building products, and so on. But I want to come back to this. In a presentation that feels like the world is crumbling and there's no hope. We are limited only by our innovation. And at the moment, our lack of innovation has been what's holding us back. Decades, generations in the making. Broad change is needed. Now, I know Australians don't typically vote for reform, but young people do. And we know that there is a changing of the guard and young people are overtaking the older voters, something to be mindful of. We need to innovate our way out of this mess, and we need to build the social license to make change. So thank you for bearing with me through that. Demography alongside social and economic factors will uncertainly lead to shifts in the way Australians live and change the future of housing. We're already seeing this in real time. Changes in housing needs will be moderately paced, but things like climate change and affordability are more imminent challenges. But with those challenges come opportunities to innovate. And on that note, I'm going to end there and pass it back to Erick, and you'll now hear from Tom.
Thanks, Liz. Very comprehensive. I think that I share that as a parents, we have this nervous about young people not having a go and how to face the housing challenges in the future. Right. For the third speaker, we have Dr. Tom Alves. Tom is head of development at the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute, AHURI. Tom has a background in housing and urban policy development, and he has a deep knowledge of built environment design and delivery process. Tom leads the professional services and strategic initiative components of AHURI's business, and he's working closely with the AHURI's university partner, Australian governments, industry, and the community sector. Tom also he studies his PhD research in housing and urban studies, and he held position at the RMIT University and the University of Melbourne in the discipline of property, architecture, and urban planning. I think that in this section, Tom will share with us the insight about the planning and related to the housing affordability issue. Please, Tom.
Thank you, Erick. I'm just about to share my screen like everybody else. So here we go. And I've turned up there. Let me get to that. Whoops, no, I don't want to go to there. I want to go here. Maybe I have to go via this. Wonderful. All right, look, thank you, Erick. Thank you, everybody, for this opportunity. And look, Liz and Nerida, thank you so much for your talks and the information that you've shared. It's been very fascinating to watch that, and it's always a bit daunting to go last because, everyone else has said everything so well, and you wonder what's left to say. But I think we've heard about housing and property markets and prices. We've heard about demography. If you can, I guess, classify my talk in a word or two, I'm going to focus on, I guess, the question of affordability and also housing policy. And hopefully that will come together nicely with the other two presentations. And just a little nod to my audience on my title screen here with a timber structure from Canberra. I want to echo the sentiments of my previous speakers in acknowledging that I'm joining you from Aboriginal land. I normally am a resident of the lands of the Kulin Nation, but today I'm in a hotel room on the land of the Turrbal and Yagara peoples in Meanjin. So it's my pleasure to join you from here, and hopefully the late checkout I've arranged will hold good and I won't be interrupted at some point during my presentation. All right, I just want to give a bit of, I guess, broad context and provide some definitions to start with. I want to talk, as I said, mainly about affordability in housing. So we'll come to some definition around that in a second. But I think it's important initially, I guess, to, and what I always start with really is placing Australia and our housing system in a broader context. Every housing system is different, and the institutional structures of our country, like those in any other country, have a profound impact on how housing is provided, the type of housing that gets provided, where and what outcomes occur. And just very high level, some of the key features of the Australian housing system that differentiate us from other countries are market provision and allocation of housing is the dominant form of provision and allocation. Well over 95% of all housing is both provided by the market and allocated by markets using price signals. And that's different from other countries where the higher levels of social and public housing provision change that mix, and there are different forms of provision. We have high historic home ownership. I won't say any more on that. We've heard a little bit about where that's been and where it's going. The detached house is dominant. Again, we've heard that from our other speakers. Higher density housing and apartments have come and gone. I'll say a little bit more about that in a short while. And our social housing sector is highly residualised. Not only is it very small by international standards, but it very much functions in our system as welfare housing, as housing of last resort, whereas in other housing systems, social housing has a much broader role to play. And probably the biggest example within the developed world, the city of Vienna, where social housing accounts for about 60% of all housing in that city, and public housing accounts for about 40%. So it doesn't have to be the way that it is here, but it is the way that it is for a range of historical reasons and because of the institutions and structures of our society. We do have a broken system at the moment, as Liz ended on, but just, I guess, to tease out some of the aspects of that, we do have a severe affordability problem, and that's where I'm going to, I guess, focus a lot of my comments today. We have high population and household growth in our cities. We have, within that growth, seen, I guess, different patterns play out, which in particular urban contexts, where we've seen not just the growth of house prices and an affordability problem emerging for lower income households, but we're seeing that play out spatially. So certain areas are becoming increasingly enclaves of wealth, where other areas of our cities are becoming enclaves of poverty, and there's some significant social impact from that. Also, our cities perform extremely poorly from an environmental perspective. We live at the rate of the consumption of 3 planets within our cities, and that hasn't, despite greater regulation coming in recent times, that hasn't done much to turn that around, and the environmental performance of our housing is particularly poor. The graph on the right relates obviously to the affordability issue, and particularly for rental households. And you can see there that in line with the release of the census every 5 years, Ahuri has funded I guess a fairly deep analysis of that data to understand and also to map what rental housing is affordable to low-income households, and also what of that affordable housing is then actually available on the market to those households to be able to access, because so much of our rental property, which on the surface appears affordable, is actually then consumed and occupied by households with more means because of that market allocation process. So, and you can see there the trend that's very clearly been playing out. So what do we need? We need more affordable housing and more social housing to assist with those households who can't operate effectively in the market and who can't currently access the very limited amount of affordable and social housing that we have available. We need much better options for renters, and we also need to transition our housing system to one that is more sustainable. The chart there just shows some modelling that we did a few years ago, trying to understand the extent of unmet need for affordable rental housing, and you can see the numbers that resulted from that piece of work. So I said I wanted to get to definitions, and I think it's important that we do be clear about what we're talking about here. I've used the terms social housing and affordable housing and public housing a few times already, but let's, I guess, understand specifically what we mean by those things. Social housing is a broad term that includes both public housing and what we call community housing, which is housing provided by not-for-profits, and collectively they're known as social housing. It's housing that's made available to rent to the tenants, and it is allocated to those tenants via, I guess, a more bureaucratic process that involves registers of interest and allocation based on certain criteria and need. Affordable housing, on the other hand, is a different beast, and it is inclusive of social housing, but when we talk about affordable housing, often what we're talking about is that housing beyond social rental housing that is often part of the wider mix of a housing system in terms of providing dwellings for lower income households or for groups who don't have the wealth to engage meaningfully in the housing market. And often governments have assistance programs that help people to access housing and which enable them to do so at lower cost to that household. Now, there's two types of affordable housing, and it's important that we're really clear about this, particularly in our current policy context, where there's a lot of emphasis on providing more affordable housing, and there are a lot of schemes out there, both at the state and federal level, and even in some local government areas, to encourage and enable more affordable housing provision. We have to be clear what we mean, and fundamentally there are two different types of affordable housing, and one is housing that is affordable relative to the market. And obviously that's going to vary very substantially based on where and what type of housing it is, because the market varies quite significantly. So a house that is, slightly, say 5 or 10% cheaper than the market rate, if it's in an expensive location, expensive market, then it's not necessarily going to be that cheap and that available to many households. But it does still have a role to play within our system, as it does in other places. And the NRAS program, which obviously is no longer current, and there are a dwindling number of NRAS properties around the country, but the NRAS program was a relative to market affordability program, although it was coupled with various access, eligibility criteria that controlled access to the program. The other way of looking at affordable housing and defining it is relative to household income. And this is, I guess, a more meaningful and more significant way of looking at affordable housing, because often it would require a more significant subsidy, a deeper subsidy, and a more significant discount in order to count as affordable. And typically, internationally, how household income and its relationship to the affordability of housing is understood is based on what is colloquially known as the 30-40 rule. So that says, broadly speaking, that housing is affordable to a household when not more than 30% of the income of that household is being consumed in housing costs. And that is, it's a measure that's been used for many, many decades, and in many countries around the world. It's a fairly blunt instrument, but what it does do is enable comparison between jurisdictions and comparison across time because of the extent to which it has been used. And the 40 part of the rule is to say that while 30% of the average household income might be an important measure of the affordability of housing, for many very high income households, 30% of income still leaves those households with significant amounts of additional money that they can spend as they choose. So spending 40, 50, even 60% of a very high income on housing can still be affordable to that household. So what we do is look at the bottom 40% of the income distribution when we apply this rule to understand housing affordability. And so that's the 40 component. Excuse me. And how does this play out across the income spectrum right now in Australia? And the chart on the left, which we put together to explain this, shows the I guess the weekly income and matches that against weekly rents to understand for each quintile, each 20% of the income distribution starting at the bottom on the left, how the affordability of rental housing stacks up for them. So you can see the top line, the weekly income of households across the distribution, indicating the price at each 20, 40, and then 60% of that distribution, and the price that rents would need to be for housing to be considered affordable for those households. And then the two horizontal lines show, and this is also, we did this a short while ago, so these numbers are out of date, but you can see how that compares with what were capital city rents at the time. Oh dear. Apologies for that. And this chart looks at, I guess, across the history of the provision of social housing and where we have, I guess, sorry, I got a bit thrown by the phone ringing on the desk here, where we've I guess come in terms of the relative provision of affordable and particularly in this case public housing. Historically, we've gone from a much higher level of provision in the period immediately after the war to significantly lower levels of relative provision. And before I move to the next part of my talk, I just wanted to end with I guess a couple of pictures of some public and social housing, and I do this to highlight that often it's been in this space that that actual innovation has occurred both in the typology of housing that's been produced and the nature and form of the dwellings, and also in the modes of construction. And even though on the left there, the public housing towers in Melbourne, which the government has I guess now got a program of demolition over the next 30 years lined up because they're not performing as well as they should be. At the time, the speed and the production efficiency of these dwellings and the particular construction methodologies were very much a cutting edge at the cutting edge of construction technology. And I just highlight this in relation to, I guess, the Wood Products Association in Australia and I guess the opportunities that exist within social and affordable housing for construction and design innovation are potentially greater than they are within the marketplace. Now, I just wanted to do a very quick policy scan. I'm conscious of time, so I'll move quite quickly, but it's important to note that policy that affects housing operates across numerous scales at Australia. We have 3 tiers of government, as you all know, and the different policy levers that each particular level of government has are shown in this chart. So it's important when we talk about housing policy and the issues that need to be addressed and the responses that we need to have, that we are thinking about who actually has, in whose jurisdiction those policy levers happen to sit and how they interact with one another. Just very quickly across the national space, which is where I wanted to focus, and I won't, in the interest of time, read this out any further, but we have a national housing and homelessness plan being established at the moment at the federal level, which is the first time in a while that we've sought to articulate a strategy for the housing system in Australia, and that hasn't. It's not public yet. It's I think in the final stages of its development, and it'll come out for discussion soon. And that is, I guess, an important framework for understanding Australian the future of particularly affordable housing policy in Australia. The HAF, the Housing Australia Future Fund package of bills that passed after some delay and considerable debate in the Australian Parliament does a number of things. It re-establishes a National Housing Supply and Affordability Council. It establishes, importantly, a fund which is in perpetuity for the funding and financing of affordable housing. It expands the remit of the National Housing Infrastructure Facility, and then it set up some new organisations within government to support that. As an aside to that, and as part of the negotiation around the HAF, of course, the Social Housing Accelerator introduced some significant additional money to be spent or at least committed relatively quickly. And this is specifically for social housing supply, and this represents the most significant injection of funding into social housing nationally that we've had in a very long time, and it's distributed amongst the states and territories according to population and with a minimum spend of $50 million in the smaller jurisdictions. And then the final piece of the, I guess, the national policy suite that we've seen emerge over the last year or so is the National Housing Accord, which I think both the previous speakers mentioned, and which, Erick, you certainly put as part of the context for this webinar series. And the Accord is seeking to bring together all levels of government, as well as the other sectors, to lay a clear groundwork and set an ambition for the greater supply of both affordable and social housing nationally. And just out of pure coincidence, the day that the Accord was announced, we released this piece of research, and I hosted a webinar on that day on this research, which was very popular as a result. Looking at the way that the private sector particularly can get involved in social and affordable housing provision. And you can access this through our website, and I would direct you there to read it further if any people in our audience are interested to understand better how their organisations can be involved in that process. But basically, there's a range of different, is one of the charts that I've sort of pulled out to summarise some of the content of that paper, but there's a range of different affordable and social housing products that potentially can be built with that money, and there's a range of different roles that different players within the space, including the private sector and the not-for-profit sector, can have to be part of that delivery. I just wanted to I guess show some of the older, just a couple of charts before I finish from some of our older research, in order to I guess further emphasise. Liz has already done a great job of doing so, but to further emphasise how difficult it's going to be to deliver on that Accord. This one was a piece of work that we did a little while ago now, but it looked at the dwelling unit commencements and completions across quite a long historical timeline. And what it finds is that the actual provision of houses by the market has been pretty constant for a very long time. And this is part of those, as I said at the beginning, quite deep, structural and cultural processes that exist within our housing system, and that have been sort of baked in there over a very long time. And then looking across that the last couple of decades within that time frame, what we can see is that while the production of new houses has been pretty flat for, just looking now from 1993 to 2010, the report was sort of done in the early 2010s, and fairly flat level of productivity. And what we have seen though is, I guess, a growing time lag in terms of the production of those houses. And that was one of the, I think, very interesting findings of that piece of work. On the other hand, within the higher density space, and both of our former speakers have raised the question of higher density housing, the missing middle, how do we intensify our housing stock and make more efficient use of our our cities and spaces. This is work that some research that I did a little while ago, looking at the provision of apartments, and this particular chart is for Melbourne. Sydney would be similar but slightly different, where the actual supply of new apartments has waxed and waned very, very substantially, and doesn't follow the same sorts of supply trends at all to detached housing, and that is due to a range, I guess, of reasons that relate to the institutional structures of how housing is supplied in Australia, and also the actual structures of the provision of that, the financing, and the way that that type of housing is delivered. And just in conclusion, I wanted to highlight in our forthcoming round of housing research, we run a publicly funded housing research grants program, and we publish about 20 reports every year, which are all freely available on our website. But one of the big pieces of work that is part of this next round is a fairly broad inquiry into housing construction constraints and innovations within the construction space. So watch out for that one, which will be published early next year. So thank you very much. That's me, and I'll hand over now to Erick.
Thanks, Tom. Again, will give us insightful about the planning and especially with the National Housing Funds and the National Housing Accord. The next session is the question and answer. I think I'll invite the audience. If you have any questions to particular speakers, you can type in the webinar chat or into the question and answer box. Please, if you can provide with the short question and to whom you want to ask, that will be helpful for us. So we can discuss. I'll check right now. Well, there's one here from Alistair who did. The National Housing Accords aspire for 1.2 million new homes over 5 years. So this means 240,000. Over 5 annually. That means the additional 80,000 dwelling a year nationally. What do panel members think of this aspiration? I think that's yes. Is there more realistic annual bidding targets? I open to the panel. I think that everyone have a view. I invite first Narita. You have what's your view on this question from Alistair?
Yeah, I mean, we're not off to a good start. The challenges, I mean, the government can only do so much. So I think this is the issue we have, is that if you have a look at government debt levels at the moment, they are extremely high. We've come out of COVID, spending a lot of money. It was a very expensive time for federal and state government. So government doesn't have a lot of money. What they do have the ability, though, to control planning. And so this is why we are seeing so much change around planning. We're trying to get a lot of development taking place, particularly close to train stations. So that makes sense. There's just so many challenges. I mean, the first one being that they can control planning, but they can't control necessarily local governments. They certainly can't control local residents. So there is a lot of pushback. People don't like high densities in their backyard. So that's going to take a lot of change. We also don't have, it's not cost effective to build at the moment. So it's very expensive to build. So that's also a challenge for developers, that it is hard for them to try and get projects up and running. And then fundamentally coming back to where is the money going to come from? Because, when we have a look at the level of social housing that has been built by government, for example, it has declined significantly. The level of the number of homes has declined significantly over decades. If we have a look globally at government track records in trying to provide housing, it hasn't been great. I think New Zealand is the most recent, where they did try to establish a housing authority. Kiwi Build just didn't achieve the aim. So government comes under the same challenges that developers come under, that it is expensive to build, there's community opposition, there's lots of challenges there. And then And then fundamentally, you know, where is the money going to come from if we're not going to get it from Asia, because that's not coming through anymore. If we have a look at local investors, that they currently provide about 90% of housing, but interest rates are very high at the moment. It's not really an attractive option for a lot of investors to buy property. And then institutional investment. So, you know, that's probably the key at the moment, is trying to get high levels of institutional investment. But I think, you know, there is a lot of naivety around institutional investment and affordability, because, you know, we do know that institutional investors also want to profit, and they aren't going to accept low yields in the same way that traditional investors have accepted high yields. So, you know, that potentially does lead to lower levels of affordability if they do need to get those higher returns. So there's just, you know, when you start to try and unpick the challenges of building all these homes, it is very, very complicated, and it's more than one factor. There's just multiple factors that need to be addressed.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question after that, but to the next panel. Liz, what do you think about this?
I agree with Nerida. We require a multi-pronged approach to this problem. It is a stubborn, complex problem, and I guess maybe I am naive in thinking this, but I think the Australian government and the federal and state governments need to step up, and that means I guess making land available and actually getting their own hands dirty and building land, building on their available land. I'm not saying that they be the builders. I'm saying they make these things available and go in with people in an equity approach. We just, I guess what I really want to say is we have a system that is monumentally a cluster F, if you like, of problems. It is so badly broken that we need to reimagine it. And I know that sounds like it's going to take a much longer time to then actually do stuff, but we can be doing things and resetting the policy landscape at the same time. Whether or not voters will support that, because you've got to think that politicians only do what is politically strategic and survivable. But that's what got us into this mess. And so we need to get to this point where I think what Tom said to me, to me is really quite powerful, is that 95% of the Australian housing market, housing is provided by the market. And I think that if we look to when all of Australia's housing woes kind of started to begin, even in a tiny bit, it happened post World War II. What happened post World War II? We had massive rebuild. Look, if we did it in that time, this kind of reset and rebuild, surely we can do that again post kind of in a post-COVID world, noting that COVID hasn't finished. But I think that there are, the social license is there. And I think what's so interesting is we've now got the problem that used to be fringe is now mainstream. So we see this issue of growing lifelong renters that is definitely in the forefront of young voters' minds. The social license is there. Governments need to roll up their sleeves and actually do stuff, and not do performative things that really aren't helpful in the long run. But we're in a tight fiscal environment, right? So everyone's going to say, well, we can't do it. Well, I think you've got to innovate your way out of it, right? And I don't get paid enough to give the answers on that one. So I'll leave it to those that do.
Thanks, Liz. What about you, Tom? You think this is realistic with that target?
Yeah, well, I could probably be paid more to say this as well, but No, thanks, Liz and Nerida. Look, it's an ambitious target, and it hasn't been done before. So yeah, our chances are looking a bit slim at the minute. But I think it's to be grabbed with some enthusiasm that there was that level of energy and desire to get something moving, and that was good. We're not going to deliver it. Our normal processes of delivering housing are not going to deliver it. I was trying to speak a bit earlier about some of, I guess, the structural limitations that exist within both provision of detached housing and provision of apartment housing that are going to mean that just leaving that to its own devices is not going to get us that number of houses, if that's the number that we want to reach. And I also want to, just say that while planning should always be, the subject of scrutiny and ongoing reform and focus, but planning's not the problem here. That if we just got rid of planning, suddenly we'd get all of the houses we needed. Planning is also an extremely important part of our system, as Liz was saying at one of her slides, talking about infrastructure and what we need, I guess, to make a community and make places where people need to go. I mean, that's all because of planning, and it needs planning for that to happen. So, planning's not the problem, although in some particular cases it can be a limiting factor. But even if we had complete just all stops out, let's go for it, I don't think we're going to see people going for it, because that doesn't I guess doesn't appreciate what private market developers need in order to to deliver housing, and one of those things is anticipated price growth, and that ability to effectively undersupply the market. I mean, that's sort of structurally baked into how that process works, because if you flooded the market with product, prices would come down, and that would stop supply, or supply would stop before that happened. So so what we need to do is also look at other ways of doing it. Nerida's mentioned the I guess alternative forms of capital that on which there has been a significant focus, and I think a lot of the federal government's interest in in enabling build to rent through taxation changes and so forth is around trying to see that capital come online more extensively. And there have been some initial examples of that kind of work happening, and where it has been where it has also been able to deliver some affordable housing product alongside what is otherwise a relatively expensive type of housing. But it does need the policy. There needs to be more to the policy than just let's see more build to rent housing if we want to actually get some affordable housing on the ground, because it's not going to deliver that.
Thanks, Tom. I run again to the audience. If you'd like to type your question, place type that in the question and answer box, or if you like to ask the question directly, I'll give that opportunity. But I come back again to Nerida for the, especially with the Australian price growing for 10.4%. In the interest of the industry, I think that's the last 12 months will be challenging for us. The last 6 months, we see that there's a slightly decline of the demand for the softwood timber. This is a bit like a puzzle for us, because you have this high demand in the housing, construction costs increase. We know that if the cost of borrowing increase, all that particle, the cost component also increase. But our industry a bit like bit puzzle. What happened here? The price of softwood bit stable, but we see the demand of house also increase, and some of the producer need to cut a bit the capacity of production. So there's a bit puzzle there, and they need to know, they want to have some of insight here what happens in the market. Probably Nerida, you have insight from here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I suppose the big issue now is that we're not building many homes. So that has led to less demand for building products. And as a result, there's flowing through to timber, for example. So it will return. I mean, I think one of the things that did lead to, I mean, you guys know your industry a lot better than me, but one of the things that did lead to very, very high prices for timber was bushfires, is my understanding. A lot of timber did get wiped out. There was very high global demand, so that seems to have been reversed. We're not seeing that same level of, as interest rates have started to rise, we're not seeing the same level of global demand for timber products as well. So I mean, across the building industry, material costs aren't an issue at the moment. They have come back, and you know, it's generally not seen as a problem. The problem for the building industry is now that labour shortages. You know, on one hand, we don't. Liz covered it. We don't have enough people here in Australia that can build homes, and then we don't have the homes for them to live in. So, you know, we've got this double problem that, you know, we need more people, but then we don't have the homes, but we still need the people to build the homes. So this is a challenge. So that's going to take a little bit of time to resolve. And then now we just have a lot of structural weakness in the building industry. So then we've got a lot of companies going into receivership. So we just have fewer companies that are able to build, which probably again feeds into the demand for building products. So yeah, I don't know when that will change. I mean, we're not seeing much construction taking place at the moment because interest rates are high and it's expensive to build, and people are being shoved into the established market instead of the new build market as a result. So it is a challenge that will take, you know, it's at least 18 months away before we're going to see these problems in the construction sector. The other thing that we are seeing too, which possibly impacts timber, is a lot of the construction industry is being diverted into infrastructure. And so there's, for example, renewables is a big one. There's a lot of wind farms that are being built. You don't need timber for wind farms. You still need a lot of aluminium, and you still need a lot of people to build them. Also, a lot of office buildings are still being built, even though people aren't back in the office. But, you know, that doesn't require timber so much. It does require a lot more concrete and steel. But we are also, on that, we are seeing pricing for steel become a lot more moderate as well. So, yeah, it's not just timber. It does seem to be other materials as well.
Yeah. Thanks, Nerida. There's one question now for Liz, but also Liz, in your presentation, you said that, you know, at the end of the day, we need to innovate with this mess. I think that's Tom also highlighted that, but we need to innovate about this issue. I think that one of these audience asked you, but it was very general here. Many reasons you innovate as a broken system. Is any path you recommend to solve this? Is quite public, but do you think that, as you said, we need this in terms of migration intake? We need these young people coming to Australia. There's many perspective, also a bit like some of the view that disagree with the migration intake, but we need that migration. And one of the key right now is we need to innovate with the current migration policy. Also, a bit changes. What's your view with you know, as in the broad, is that part of the innovation the government's already starts to innovate with this you know, action? What do you think?
Yeah, look, Australia's immigration system and scheme and program generally is showing its age and showing fractures within it. Definitely there is room to improve the migration program and system itself. I think what's so tricky though is that when we talk about housing and then we talk about population and immigration, we get caught up in knots and we don't get to the very solution, which is not a migration moratorium. Stopping migration is not going to fix the problem. In it, we need, as I said, and it might sound a bit like kind of weasel words, but innovation is the way out of it, right? So how can we think of innovative ways to get out of a crisis? And we see multiple fronts of crisis. It's not just housing, it's social welfare, it's you know, we've got issues within the sector I work in, higher education, where we're seeing job cuts and we're seeing tightening of the belt financially, and we need to continue to do business as usual. So we're having to learn to do things with less, right? And demographically, that's what we're going to have to do. We're going to have to do things, our general business that government provides, with less tax that comes from individuals. So how do we innovate our way out of that? Well, we think, how can we ensure that government bottom line is strong? Well, maybe we need to change the way we tax things, the way that we tax operations, and not just rely on individual income taxpayers as the way to fuel coffers and so on. More broadly, though, more research, more needs to be done to understand the situation that we're in, and perhaps how that we can pull different levers. But at the same time, research can be a long time coming. So research and development and innovation need to go hand in hand, and we need to see a more pragmatic approach to action research, rather than research that kind of sits and gets done over here. We need to see more earnest commitment from government and policymakers to actually be using the evidence base. I mean, the wealth of information that Ahuri has, that Tom showcased a little of, is just incredible. But is anyone listening? And are policymakers listening? And that, I think, is probably one of the most frustrating things. And if we come back, if I can dare answer the question, or address the question from Mohammed in the webinar chat, what can this industry do? The timber industry. Again, it comes down to, how can your business model be brought into more of a contemporary response to the, dare I say, clusterfuck of what's going on right now, right? The multiple fronts of crises. How can we think about the contemporary situation and innovate to respond to that, and find new markets, find new ways, and that might mean responding to environmental avenues and opportunities that are presented via challenges. So I don't have a nice, neat answer for you. These are philosophical challenges, right? But I think the first stage is to identify these issues, call it what it is. It's a crisis. And I'm so pleased to hear that both Nerida and Tom have used that word, because there are many that refrain from using the word crisis in this context. If we give the label it requires, then we're going to more likely see action, right? So maybe that's the first step.
Yeah. No, I have follow up here. It's one of the industry texts me in particular about your slide in household types, because we have this 1-person household. This is the data, and that's along the times that can be increasing, slightly increasing, but keep going the trend. Now she asked me about is that will be like the future trend of Australia as a 1-person household? And she also asking, because should we, our industry, most of the sawmills, they're in the regional area, and some of them probably living city close to that sawmills, and they're thinking that whether they should, as a young people, a lifestyle, so they move to the capital city, or just buried the dreams, Australian dreams, to having a house. What do you think with this trend, Liz?
So firstly, let me start by saying that people will live where they can afford, that meets their desired lifestyle, and that maximizes their opportunities either for themselves or for their children by way of education and employment. They're the two big things, right? Education and employment. And so if we look at that, and then we look at the urbanisation is a big thing in Australia. We are not likely to see regionalisation or decentralisation of the population anytime soon without any major policy intervention. And policy interventions in this regard have largely failed historically in Australia. People just kind of return back. They don't tend to stay. And even when there are financial incentives for, say, for example, workers, doctors to go and work in regional areas, they return to capital cities. And capital cities are still growing at the fastest population growth rate when we compare them to non-capital city areas. So that's just the reality, right? So the next question is around what happens with housing types. We have seen over the long term, if we look back, and history is a good indication of what the future is going to hold, right? So if we look back, we see one person or lone person households were not a really big feature. But as a result of, and it's largely as a function of an aging population, we are seeing more and more people living alone. Now, that means a different style of homes. And so, you know, in the kind of demographic theory, we always theorize that when we saw this aging transition, which by the way is we're all living it out in real time, and it's not something we can look to other countries because we're experiencing it at a similar rate at the same time. So we've got no kind of this is what best practice is type thing to do. But we hypothesized that, you know, based on all the theory that we had available to us, people would downsize. So we would have a market flooded with these big homes and so on. But we're not seeing that. We're not seeing housing and family homes being made available to the next generation. And so what then happens is we've got this mismatch of housing needs, and there are a number of factors that are preventing people from downsizing. It's expensive to refurb your home to make it accessible for someone with different mobility needs. It's difficult to find smaller housing that fits your financial situation in your area, that is still connected to your local church or your local social group, your friends, your family, and so on. So there's all of this stuff happening. So to address the kind of issue about the lone family households, it will likely increase with time as purely as a function of our changing demographic age and sex structure. The problem with that, though, is if you think about lone person living, it then changes the environmental footprint of how we do things, right? We all have a fridge each. We all have a microwave each. We all have, you know, all of these things that perhaps could be shared or shared more effectively and efficiently. And so all of these different considerations and innovations, dare I say, need to be done and thought of to accommodate these changing demographic characteristics. But also I do see a room for not only accommodating the demographic change, but also innovations can actually change human behavior, that in a bad way, but also in a positive way. And so there is this opportunity to consider how, say, for example, the timber industry and so on can rethink and innovate in the space of housing and homes that might actually then change or accommodate preferences in a different way. Because we know that preferences for housing have changed as the availability and affordability has changed.
That's right. Thanks, Liz. I have an email here. Question, one for Nerida, one for Tom. go for Nerida first. I think this is from the colleague that you changed in your presentation about the cash rates that will be cut at the end of start next year. So that will be like some bad news for personal, also for business. The question is, that will change with the times, or is that will be like a dynamics? He asked about this is like is the cost of borrowing and cost of business, which is that referred to the RBA cash rate. Is that likely if inflation keep increasing, then we just put that kind of interest rate will be years ahead? What do you think, Rita?
Look, I doubt it'll be years ahead. I mean, inflation is coming down, and the Reserve Bank aim to get to between 2 and 3%, sitting at 3.4. So it's absolutely coming down. It does mean that rates will be cut at some point. I guess the big challenge, I mean, interest rate forecasting is such a hard thing to do. I mean, there's probably three ways. The first one is you can look at the data, take your own opinion, talk to a few people, come up with where you think it'll go. You can build a model, that's another way. And, models have their own weaknesses, and, often the more complicated the model, the less accurate it can be. So, that's a challenge. And then there's a third way, which I think is probably the best because it does update in real time, is just looking at the ASX interest rate futures index. And that is, people invest in that. They put money into it to try and, work out what's happening with interest rate fluctuations. And that does provide real time. So that provides real time insights as to where rates are going to head. So right now, it's looking really bad. It's saying end of 2025, but we had that inflation number that came out last week. We could have some data coming out next week that shows weakness in the Australian economy, and that will then adjust downwards again. So and then again, we could have inflation data coming out in the June quarter, which may be down at 3%, which completely changes the outlook again. So we do need to be very careful and very mindful of what forecasts are saying. But at the same time, personally, I would be, I wouldn't be counting on a rate cut this year. I think it is looking increasingly unlikely. And, to be on the side of caution, that's probably a good strategy to take. But I would also I think it's very highly unlikely we're going to see a rate rise, even though there was some commentators last week that were coming out and saying that. So that's my view. Assume no cut this year. Assume it's probably going to happen next year. But, if it happens earlier, then, obviously for people that are operating businesses or have home loans or, are reliant on what happens to interest rates, that's probably a reasonable outlook in terms of what to take.
One more question, Narita. I think that's one of the, again, coming from our colleagues here, asking about the building activities, because they think, we never built that 1.2 million, but at least the strategy right now, building vertical in the building houses.
Yeah.
Your view in the property market right now, the approval, commencement, completion, and we still have this backlog, in the pipes. Do you think that probably the strategy we should take to build more house or dwellings?
Yeah, I mean, we have to get high densities. I mean, there's no alternative. I mean, there's the way that, I mean, Australia has very low densities. I mean, you can compare us to anywhere in the world, and we're very low densities. Areas that are affordable do have high densities. I think, Tom looked at Melbourne CBD, and that's affordable for a global city. To be able to live in a global city and pay, sub 400 rent per week I mean, you're not getting good quality necessarily, but you can still live at that price is quite incredible in terms of its affordability. So we do need to build more. But I suppose one of the other points I want to make is no country is doing affordability well. And, people will often point to Singapore and say, well, Singapore do a good job. And look, they do a good job in some respects, but there's some unique characteristics of that country. The government owns all the land. You know, we don't, our government doesn't own much land. So there's not much land that they can give up. Also, though, with Singapore, they rely heavily on migrant housing. So we had a colleague, not a colleague, we had an investor who was looking at build to rent coming from Singapore, and you know, we were talking about affordability, and we're saying, you know, it's a big challenge in Australia. You know, people can't afford to buy homes, rents have become incredibly expensive, and his answer was, well, why don't you build migrant housing? You know, why don't you just build dormitories to put all the migrants in? And this is the thing, like, I don't think people in Australia, I mean, we were like, you know, shocked. We're like, oh, well, we can't do that. That's, you know, that's not kind of the housing that Australians are, you know, what we consider okay. But, you know, that's the reality in a lot of countries. They are building migrant housing. They're building very cheap housing. They're looking at quite drastic ways to cope with affordability. And I don't think we should be going down that track. I think, you know, we do want to maintain a lifestyle that we're used to a certain extent, but it can't be the lifestyle that we were used to 30 years ago, where, you know, the expectation was a quarter-acre block and a big family home and 2 or 3 spare bedrooms. Like that's not the reality. The reality is smaller homes, higher densities, living close to amenity, living close to public transport, being more walkable. You know, that is the reality, and that's what has to change. We don't want to go so drastic that we provide housing that we're just not comfortable for people to live in.
And that will be connect to question for you, Tom, about social housing. Email again said about the strategy right now with the National Housing Accord. I think the government's provide billions of dollars to provide access to social housing. Question now is that social housing needs to be a bit more from the capital cities. The question is, you know, for the affordability of social housing, should we build in the more far away from capital cities for affordability, because relative to the cost of living and close to the facility? What do you think, Tom, with you know, allocation with the to the states from the federal government and the access to the social housing?
Okay, I think I understand the question there. There's a few different bits to it, but look, I mean, there's a couple of things. One was about location of social housing, and the other one was about the cost to build it, was it? Or
it's the location of social housing, the access.
Yeah, okay.
I think the question is about whether the social housing should be in the regional area. I believe, because as you said, about cost of the major cities for the cost of living.
Yeah, look, I can't give a better explanation about where people want to live than the one Liz gave a short while ago, when she said people will live, you know, where they can afford, in, you know, the best housing they can get at that price, and in the locations that enable them to, I guess, get on with the fundamental things in their lives, like their work and the employment, education of their children. So, I mean, they're the drivers, and so in terms of where social housing should be, it should be in those locations where people are wanting to be, because there is employment there, because there are there's the social infrastructure and the services that people and households need, like education, healthcare, all of those sorts of things. So just like any sort of housing, the social housing needs to be where the people can live their lives, which is in those locations that have those opportunities and services. So, that, I mean, that's the short answer. But it does. Where does that play out then nationally? I mean, a lot of that means that we do need more affordable and social housing in our cities, where we've got the biggest household growth. But we also need, in some regional and rural locations, we also need housing there as well, but probably not the same amount. Yeah, that's what we need. But in terms of the cost of delivery and the funding of it, which I think was the other dimension of the question, I mean, there's, as I said, an unprecedented scale of money and finance that's been made available to deliver this. But the reality is that even once we've spent all of that, we won't have delivered enough housing to meet the needs for the number of households who are not able to pay a full market price for either their purchase of their housing or their rent. So it's going to be something that we're going to need to continue to work on, and we do need, I think, in our country to to rebuild and to re-establish alternative tenure opportunities for households, for low-income households, but not only the most destitute, but increasingly a large number of low-income working households.
Thanks, Tom. There's one question here. I think that we still have short of the time. Probably if one of the panels wants to take, has the increase in Airbnb style initiative remove housing from the system enough to have an impact? And if you, Liz, would you like to share your view in this question?
Yeah, short answer is yes. And we see across the country efforts and discussion of ways to increase rates, council rates and things like that to effectively punish people who are making their homes available via platforms like Airbnb and not doing something else with them. And so this goes to the heart of this idea of the mismatch of our housing system. So, and that's, I think, there are so many levels of brokenness, if you like, that there's no one element that we can just simply point to. Airbnb is one of them.
Tom, quick answer.
Yeah, look, we do need to do it. It's I mean, this is something that has quite a significant amount of regional variation. There are some places where we really do need to act, and I note that the Byron Shire, for example, in northern New South Wales, has taken a harder line on this than other parts of the country, based on some work that we were able to do with them, and that has that's starting to make a bit of a difference there, and it's certainly something they need to do. It's not something that it's not an issue universally. It is quite a localized issue that where it exists does need to be tackled.
Nerida still?
Yeah, sorry, I am still here. My computer's gone, battery's gone flat. Yeah, absolutely. I think coming back to what Tom said, it is a very big problem in some regional areas. I mean, we will continue to see some changes to policy. I mean, we've got Busselton banning holiday homes outright in some suburbs. We've had additional Airbnb taxes put in place. I mean, I think it's not just Airbnb. I think it's also holiday homes, and holiday homes are a problem. People love them. I mean, I don't have a holiday home, but a lot of people do have them. There's a lot of family memories that are built up, and a lot of people have fond memories of them, but they do create problems because if you have a look at the places where we have the highest number of vacant properties, I think it's like the Mornington Peninsula in Melbourne, Portsea is 33% occupied in any given time. So clearly, if you've got 75 or 65% of homes not being used, then that's a problem. So I think there's a lot of issues with housing efficiency, and vacant homes is one, and the other one is spare bedrooms. That we have 13 million spare bedrooms. We've got a lot of older Australians with 3+ spare bedrooms. Obviously, people can't really easily rent out spare bedrooms, but it then comes down to how do we get older people out of these massive homes and into smaller ones. And there's lots of challenges, but ensuring housing supply in places they want to live is a big one.
Thanks, Nerida. I think that's conclude our webinar for today. It's 5 minutes to 12. Again, for audience, I'd like to thank for all audience attending this first webinar. The FWPA webinar series. This is the first webinar series, so we'd like to have, it's multidimensional issues, but we'd like to know the comprehensive what's behind this issue about housing affordability. Next week webinar, we will have the industry within the industry and what's their view about the supply, especially with the timber industry. And the webinar 3 will talk about a bit more about perspective in terms of the government initiative. So the summary of this webinar, we'll provide some summary in our website. I think one of the objective of this webinar is to provide our members, the industry as a whole, about the how to understand about the issue, what our contribution from our industry, and the perspective about the initiative. So hopefully that help people and also our audiences right now. I'd like to thank the speaker, Narita Konisby, Liz Allen, Tom Alves. Appreciate your time. I believe the industry, have insights and also the knowledge benefit for them. We know that this is keep going, and we always find every day, the issue about housing in the newspaper and our media outlets. Again, thank you very much for the webinar, and for everyone's also attending on behalf of the FWPA. Well, also thanks for your attendance here, and we'll see you again for the next event. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Erick.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.